The moment I understood what I had inherited, I was standing in my kitchen holding a phone I had just slammed against the counter and shaking with an anger so familiar it felt like coming home. My partner was in the next room, silent in the way that people go silent when they have learned that silence is safer than speaking, and the silence was so recognizable that it stopped me mid-breath. I had heard that silence before. I had produced it before. I had been the person sitting in the next room, going quiet and small and careful, while someone I loved filled the space with something large and hot and not entirely directed at me, but landing on me anyway because I was the nearest available surface. I had been that person for years, and now I was the other one. I set the phone down slowly. I walked to the doorway, and I looked at my partner, and I saw in their face the specific arrangement of features I had worn so many times in my own childhood that I could have drawn it from memory. The careful neutrality, the slight tension around the eyes, the particular quality of attention that is not relaxed attention, but watchful attention, the attention of someone who is monitoring the emotional weather of the room and adjusting their behavior in real time to minimize the chance of another storm. I had grown up making that face. I had spent years making it so automatically that I had stopped knowing I was making it, and now I was on the other side of it, and the recognition was so complete and so devastating that I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working properly. I was my father. Not in every way. Not in the ways that would have been easiest to identify and therefore easiest to guard against. Not in the dramatic ways, the ways you could point to and say that is the thing I will never do because I know exactly how it felt when it was done to me. In the quieter ways, the ways that had installed themselves so early and so completely that they had stopped feeling like behaviors and started feeling like character. The way I escalated when I felt unheard rather than finding a way to be heard more clearly. The way I needed to be right in arguments more than I needed the argument to be resolved. The way I sometimes made the people I loved feel responsible for managing my emotional state rather than taking responsibility for it myself. The way anger was always closer to the surface than I admitted, and the way I had, until that moment on the kitchen floor, told myself a story about that anger that cast it as justified rather than inherited. My father was not a monster. I want to be careful about that because the version of these stories that gets told most often requires a villain, and my father was not one. He was a man who had grown up inside his own father's mistakes and had absorbed them with the same unconscious completeness that I had absorbed his. He was a man who loved his family with a genuineness I never doubted, and who also, without ever intending to, made the people in his family feel that love was conditional on the management of his feelings. He did not know he was doing it. That is the part that took me the longest to understand. He genuinely did not know. The behavior was so deeply embedded in his understanding of how relationships worked, so thoroughly normalized by his own experience of being loved, that it did not register as behavior at all. It registered as reality, as the way things are, as the shape of love itself. And he had handed it to me not as a lesson or a mandate, but as an atmosphere, the invisible medium in which I had grown up and breathed and learned what closeness felt like, and what safety felt like, and what being known felt like. By the time I was old enough to examine any of it, I had already built my entire emotional architecture around it. I did not know that what I had inherited was not the only available blueprint. I did not know that the patterns I was living inside were patterns rather than facts. I knew something felt wrong, had known it for years in the vague and uncomfortable way that you know something is wrong when you cannot name it clearly enough to address it. I knew that my relationships followed a shape I did not like. I knew that certain triggers in me were disproportionate to the situations that activated them. I knew that I was sometimes a person I did not want to be in moments of stress, and that the gap between who I wanted to be and who I was in those moments was wider than anything I could explain by intention or effort alone. What I did not know was that I was not malfunctioning. I was executing a program. A program installed before I had the cognitive capacity to evaluate it, written in the language of early experience, running in the background of every relationship and every conflict and every moment of emotional difficulty with a consistency and efficiency that no amount of willpower had been able to interrupt, because willpower operates at the level of conscious choice, and the program was running somewhere older and deeper than conscious choice could reach. The kitchen floor moment was the beginning of a different kind of work, not the work of becoming someone else, not the work of erasing my father from myself, cutting the connection, deciding that love required distance and distance required silence. The work of something much harder and much more specific than any of those things. The work of learning to see the program clearly, enough to decide consciously and deliberately which parts of it to keep running and which parts to rewrite. That work did not happen quickly. It did not happen in a single conversation with a therapist or a single book that explained everything or a single moment of clarity, after which everything reorganized itself into sense. It happened slowly and recursively and sometimes painfully across years of paying the kind of attention to myself that I had never been taught to pay, the kind that requires you to stay in the room with what you find rather than rearranging it into something more flattering. The first thing I discovered when I started paying real attention was that the shadow was larger than I had thought. I had expected to find a few specific patterns, the obvious ones, the ones I had already half identified in the comfortable way we identify things we are not yet fully committed to changing. The anger that came too fast, the difficulty asking for help, the tendency to perform capability even when I was drowning, because drowning was private and capability was the only currency I had grown up understanding as consistently valuable. I had found those things already, and I had named them, and I had felt, in the naming, a premature satisfaction, as if identifying a thing was the same as addressing it, and addressing it was the same as being free of it. It was not. Naming a pattern is the beginning of the work, not the end of it, and the work that comes after the naming is the part nobody talks about, because it is slower and less dramatic and does not have the clean narrative shape of a revelation. What I found when I went deeper was not more patterns of the same kind. What I found was the belief system underneath the patterns, the invisible architecture that the patterns were built on, the foundational assumptions about how the world worked and what I deserved from it and what other people could be trusted to provide, and what I had to secure for myself before anyone had the chance to withhold it. My mother believed at a level so fundamental she would not have called it a belief, but simply a description of reality, that love was something you earned, not consciously, not explicitly. She never sat me down and said you must perform in order to be loved, but the atmosphere of our home was organized around that principle in ways I absorbed before I had language for any of it. Praise arrived in response to achievement. Warmth expanded when I succeeded and contracted, not into coldness exactly, but into a kind of emotional neutrality that felt like absence when I failed or struggled or needed something I could not justify by productivity. I had learned before I understood that I was learning anything, that my value was contingent, that it fluctuated with my output, that the safest position was to always be producing something. That justified my place in the room. I had carried that belief into every relationship I had ever had, every workplace, every friendship, every moment of vulnerability where I had to decide whether to show what I actually needed or to manage the presentation of myself so carefully that the need became invisible and the competent surface remained intact. I had been doing it so long and so automatically that I had built an entire identity around it. I was the capable one, the one who handled things, the one you did not have to worry about. And I had believed genuinely believed that this was a strength rather than a
scar.
The grief that came when I finally saw it clearly was not what I expected. I had expected anger. I had primed myself for anger because anger is easier than grief, because anger has an object and a direction, and a narrative of injustice that lets you stand somewhere outside the pain rather than inside it. What came instead was something softer and more disorienting. It was sorrow for my mother. Real sorrow. The kind that comes when you understand someone's limitations well enough to see not just what they cost you, but what they cost her. Because the belief that love must be earned was not something she had invented.
It was
something she had received from her own mother, who had received it from hers, passed down through generations of women who had learned that their value was conditional and had organized their entire emotional lives around the project of meeting the conditions, and who had loved their daughters genuinely and also handed them the same impossible contract without knowing they were handing them anything at all.
He said,
with that sorrow for a long time, not as a performance of forgiveness, not as a strategy for releasing resentment, but as an honest response to an honest understanding. My parents had not failed me out of indifference. They had failed me out of the specific blindness of people who are living inside a story they cannot see because they have never been outside it. And the fact that their failure had a cause, that it was explicable and human and rooted in their own unexamined inheritance, did not erase the cost, but it changed the weight of the cost.
It
changed what I was carrying and who I was carrying it for. The separation came slowly and in pieces, and was not the clean severing that the word separation implies. It was more like learning to distinguish between what was mine and what I had been handed, and then deciding, deliberately and repeatedly, what to do with each thing I found. Some of what I had inherited I kept. My father's work ethic, which had its roots in anxiety but also in genuine pride and care. My mother's attention to other people's emotional states, which had its roots in hypervigilance, but had also given me a capacity for empathy that I did not want to lose, simply because I was learning to deploy it without the fear that had originally generated it. I kept those things, not passively, not by
default, but by choice,
which made them mine in a way they had not been before. The things I did not keep I released with more effort and less drama than I had anticipated, not in a single decision, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. The moment I chose to ask for help instead of performing self-sufficiency, the moment I let an argument end without winning it, the moment I told my partner what I actually needed instead of waiting for them to intuit it and resenting them when they could not. Each of those moments was a rewrite, small and imperfect and sometimes followed by a regression into the old program, but accumulating, building something that had not existed before, a way of moving through the world that had been chosen rather than inherited, a self that was related to my parents but not determined by them, connected to the shadow but no longer living inside it. I still catch myself running the old program sometimes. I want you to know that because the version of this story that ends with complete liberation is a lie, and I have no interest in telling it. I catch myself performing capability when I am
exhausted.
I catch myself needing to be right when being connected would serve me better. I catch myself monitoring the emotional weather of a room with the hypervigilance of a child who learned that weather could change without warning and that preparation was the only available protection. I catch myself and I pause and I make a different choice, and sometimes I make it well and sometimes I make it badly, and on both kinds of days I am no longer ashamed of what I find, because what I find is not evidence of my failure. It is evidence of where I came from.
And
where I came from is part of me. My parents are part of me.
Their
mistakes are part of me, not as a sentence, as a history.
And the
difference between a sentence and a history is the most important thing I have ever learned. A sentence determines your future. A history informs it. I am not escaping my parents' mistakes. I am learning to carry them without being carried by them. And that is not a lesser freedom. That is the only real one.